Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is James Walsh. I'm Head of Membership Engagement here at the PLSA. Pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on 5 steps to better pensions, which squarely reflects the PLSA's mission, which is all about helping people to get better incomes in retirement. I'm going to be joined this morning by my colleagues Simon Sarkar and Alyshia Harrington-Clark, and also I'm very pleased to be joined by Roy Brown, who's UK Pensions Manager at Jaguar Land Rover. We're going to make this interactive. Do fire in your questions. But let's start with Simon, who's going to give his assessment of just how big is the pensions adequacy challenge at the moment. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, James, and good morning to everyone joining us on the webinar today. The cost of living crisis is a stark reminder of the impact of incomes being unable to cope with the cost pressures on household budgets. So it's probably never been more important to look at what might be a considerable future financial shock for some if the issue of adequacy in their pension or future income is not addressed. I'm going to kick off our discussions today with a look at the big picture question: are people currently saving enough for retirement? The first question that arises is, how are we going to determine whether a household has an adequate income or not? There are 2 key ways of conceptualizing an adequate income. The first is through a proportional income target, which is the approach that was used by the Pensions Commission to address adequacy. These work on the basis that an individual retirement income should be targeted at achieving a proportion of an individual's working income immediately preceding retirement. The target replacement rate, as illustrated in the chart, reduces according to the levels of earnings, so that those with the lowest incomes prior to retirement are considered to almost need to maintain that level into retirement, whereas someone on a higher income may not need to do so, as they in theory face lower costs, such as no longer paying off a mortgage, have lower travel costs associated with stopping work, and reduce discretionary spending, as it was considered that expenditure reduces with older ages. Now, we could probably debate where some of these points may not be as relevant today or in the future, but certainly something that I've been struck by in our discussions with members of the public throughout our research is the desire for people to try and maintain the status quo. Another research has shown a degree of convergence of the expected living standards of people during their working life into retirement. In other words, they don't necessarily want a drop in what they have been used to. Another way of looking at adequacy is against a fixed income target that delivers a defined living standard. And the PLSA's very own retirement living standards convey what expenditure is required to achieve 3 different living standards at the minimum, moderate, and comfortable. The standards themselves were arrived at by research with members of the UK public to land on a consensus view of the baskets of goods and services that should make up a particular standard. They're kept up to date and relevant by regular reviews of the costs of goods and services that make up the standards. So reviewing the content of the baskets themselves to account for changes in the public's tastes and needs. Now, we launched the very latest retirement living standards just a couple of weeks ago, and it shows the expenditure required to achieve the 3 standards for individuals and for couples. As you'll see from the slide, there's been a substantial rise in expenditure required to achieve each level, which reflects the increases in costs, particularly in the areas of food and energy, which is hit hardest at the minimum level. In order to assess the population's current levels of pensions adequacy, we commissioned the Pensions Policy Institute to update the modelling work they'd previously carried out last year for People's Partnership. The modelling work uses the Office for National Statistics Wealth and Assets Survey as its main data source. So it's a really good quality survey source of around 17,000 households. And their latest update reflects not only the very latest retirement living standards, but also the recent increase in the state pension announced at the end of last year. So using the first measure of the Pensions Commission replacement rate, we can see in the charts in front of you that just over half of all households are on track to meet it. less than half of the working population will meet it, and that's defined as a household where at least one member of the household is in employment or self-employment. And of particular interest to us, around 2/5 of active DC households where at least one member is saving into a DC pension is on track to meet it. Now, as I previously discussed, this reveals whether people are achieving their replacement targets relative to their final working income. But what are the results in terms of meeting the expenditure requirements of the different living standards? Sorry, I just amended to the right slide there. My final slide in this section shows that around 7 out of 10 amongst the whole population are on track to meet the minimum standard, compared to almost 8 out of 10 of those either in working households or indeed in households where there's someone currently saving into a DC pension. This drops to 35% of DC savers who are currently projected to meet the moderate, and less than 1 in 10 who look likely to achieve the comfortable standard. So James, I hope that gives our viewers a useful introduction to our very latest analysis from the PPI modelling work, and I'm happy to take questions or comments either now or later on.
Yeah, fine. Thanks, Simon. That's a great start for us. And just one question for me, if you will. What have we assumed in all this about how people will take out retirement decisions, about how to use their DC pot? You know, are we assuming they annuitize or do drawdown or what?
Yeah, thanks, James. So there's a detailed paper on the PPI's assumptions, and that's been published on the PPI website. But in terms of into retirement incomes assumed to come from drawdown, and people are also assumed not to take their 25% tax-free cash. That's an important thing to note. But I would say all the details are in the report that's published in the technical report that's available on the website.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. That's great, and we'll be coming back to you later, of course. So don't go away. But let's bring Alyshia in now. And Alyshia, I know you've been working very hard on our 5 Steps to Better Pensions report and consultation, and I think you're going to talk through the key ideas in that. Good morning.
Morning, everyone. Morning, James, and thank you very much. I am just going to briefly talk through the 5 Steps to Better Pensions report. This was published last year at our annual conference. And what the report does is it outlines the positive story so far on automatic enrolment and sets out what reforms the PLSA believe are needed to ensure that the largest number of people possible retire with an adequate pension. And as you'll have heard from Simon's presentation so far, some of the picture there is really quite bleak. So what the report does is it starts a consultation period, which is the beginning of a wider campaign, which we've really already been running, but we're sort of relaunching here. And what we're hoping is that we can seek views from interested parties, stakeholders, all of you, on our research and proposals. And this consultation period will run for another couple of months at least. We really want to know your views on it, and I'll drop some information about the roundtables that we're running and the requests for further input throughout the discussion, because we'd really like to hear your views. I think what we've heard, though, from Simon is that there are some issues with the way that the framework is currently working. And in a sense, it's therefore very important for us to consider what opportunities there are for change. So in this section, what I'm going to do is just quickly run through the assessment that we've made of the issues and some of the solutions. I'll come back in detail to the individual limbs later. But I'll do so how I think about them rather than necessarily exactly how this slide sets them out. So don't be alarmed. I'm not just going to speak to the slide. You can see there are several sort of different limbs of proposals that we hope to get through in the next couple of years. So one of the key issues is that there's a lack of clear objectives and goals for the pension system. And given that there are no goals, not very much monitoring of their performance. So I think we should ask ourselves a question here: what are pensions for? In the UK, we really have no up-to-date common definition of what an income in retirement should achieve. And without that, it's hard to create the right system or check whether it's delivering. So it's really no surprise, as we've heard from Simon, that so many people fall short of the retirement income goals set by the Pensions Commission. Also, they were set back in 2005. Maybe we need to review some of those. We really believe that the UK pension system should set an objective to be adequate, affordable and fair. I will come back to that in a different slide because you'll all say to me, well, how are you defining that? So I'll come back to it. Just also to note that the Work and Pensions Select Committee have really agreed that there need to be a set of clearer objectives. And so this one we feel has got some strong consensus. The next one down is state pension. To avoid poverty in later life, we think the state pension needs to increase. So it's just above one measure of poverty, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's absolute minimum, and it sort of tracks that, but at a very small increase. But it's really far below other common poverty measures. And that Joseph Rowntree Foundation's absolute minimum is sometimes referred to as a destitution level, whereas other poverty measures are as high as £15,000 or maybe even £20,000. So the current level is pretty inadequate. £20,000, I would have thought, is quite unaffordable. Whereas, as Simon's mentioned, the retirement living standard sits somewhere in between and allows savers to enjoy life as well as sort of meet that destitution level, that minimum standard. So that's our retirement living standard minimum is about 15% higher than the state pension. Obviously, the state pension will increase with the triple lock. Obviously, our retirement living standards increase with inflation as well. So, you know, there is a sort of tracking question here, but it does feel that we do need to bring the state pension more in line with that of other countries. And also there may be ways of doing that in a more affordable way to meet our objectives, such as looking at means tested benefits, for example. Small plug, if you're really interested in state pension, this is one of our key limbs and we really want to hear from you. I will drop all of the roundtable timings in the chat in a second, but the reform of the state pension roundtable is coming up on the 13th of February. So if you're not planning to send us a written response, I'd love for you to email us and come and join that session to talk about the state pension in more detail. Next down is automatic enrolment and contributions. These two are split on the slide, but I'm going to talk about them together because to me, they feel like they're the same thing, really. We really need to make a plan for higher contribution levels. Not today. We're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, but at some point in the future. As long ago as 4 years ago in our hitting the target report, actually, that will be 5 years ago by calendar year, total contributions, we believe, need to reach 12% by the early 2030s. And for us, this is the single most effective reform to get people back on track. Simon will talk about the modelling later, of course. But this needs to be done gradually. And so from the mid-2020s, and or when the cost of living crisis has eased a little, we would like the government to implement their own recommendations on automatic enrolment, which was the AE review of 2017. That reduces the qualifying age for automatic enrolment. It removes the lower earnings limit gradually, so that everyone will benefit from pension saving from the first pound of earnings. And then it also, we also believe that some of the other changes that we can talk to in more detail if they come up in questions will make a really big difference to increasing contributions for those that will benefit the most from those in retirement. So this sort of reform of automatic enrolment piece is very important to us. And then finally, industry initiatives. This is our final call, and it's to support and encourage those initiatives that help make the most out of money being saved. And really, our PLSA members are already delivering these. So we already have the pensions quality mark, which demonstrates quality and enhanced contributions. We're delivering initiatives like the retirement living standards. You guys are delivering the sort of use and application of those in digital tools. We've been coming up with solutions for small pots. We've been looking at enhancing understanding with dashboards, work for dashboards, simpler annual statements. We have the Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign. We've been sort of proponents of policy change like introduction of CDC, the PLSA's Guide of Retirement Income Choices. So this is all about taking a look at those initiatives that can really enhance the voluntary contribution space, so the voluntary increasing of contribution space, I guess. That's a bit later on if we're talking about that sort of thematically in the campaign and the consultation period. I think the session for that is the middle of March. Again, I'll drop the timings in the chat, but if you want to join a roundtable on what the industry is doing, then we'd love to hear from you. And we're obviously going to talk about that a little bit today too. So I'm just going to show you a quick diagram. Oh, I'm having the same issue as Simon. Show you a quick diagram here, which basically says the same stuff, but in a slightly different way, and it's a bit prettier. So just to recap, we're proposing 5 steps to pensions adequacy. So that's first, a new objective, adequate, affordable and fair. I'll come back to that, I promise. Second, increasing the state pension to match the minimum retirement living standard, and this helps prevent pensioner poverty. Third, opening automatic enrolment to more people and increasing contributions. Fourth, help people with very low pensions, and I'll speak to that in a second because I haven't yet really. And finally, work with everyone, such as you, who can help deliver better outcomes for savers. So I'll just quick up the adequate, affordable and fair frameworks. I've said it several times now and haven't explained it. So what do we mean? We are consulting on this, of course, but this is our sort of best effort so far. What we think an objective should do is make sure that people achieve that. The system is designed to achieve those 3 sort of targets. So what does adequate mean? We think that this means that nobody lives their later life in poverty, and many can maintain a fair proportion of their pre-retirement income. Affordable means that both workers and employers can afford to save, and we protect those on lower earnings from over-saving. And then fair means that we help all workers balance the cost between them, all workers, and balance the cost between them and their employers. So it's about fairness for the saver as well as across the system who's contributing. If you'd like to talk to us about the adequate, affordable and fair objective, and this is one that really I think everyone can engage with this debate, because it's really about, it's sort of about what pensions are for. We are, of course, running a roundtable on that, and that one's coming up very quickly. That's in a couple of weeks. It's the 7th of February, I believe. So just quickly on underpension groups, because I just mentioned them again in sort of detail in relation to this diagram. People with very low pensions or projected to have very low pensions. So increasing contributions, reducing the minimum age, I've already mentioned, removing the lower earners limit. This all gives people more time and a larger salary base on which to build their savings. But there really are some other reforms needed for certain groups. So I'll give you a few examples. This is not exhaustive. Women in their 60s have just 1/3 of pension wealth that men have. Women are also more likely to belong to the 1.2 million people in the UK with multiple jobs. And this means that many often don't meet the 10K AE threshold in any one of those jobs, and it needs to be per job at the moment. This threshold, the 10K threshold, also disproportionately excludes ethnic minorities who are much more likely to have no pension saving at all, and are also more likely to be paying rent in retirement. So we do have some specific proposals, some clear benefits for the 10K trigger applying across multiple jobs, for example. But we also do need to look at how we calibrate automatic enrolment to work best for those that are currently underpensioned, but also those that may be very low earners. And there's quite a high correlation, as you would imagine, between these two things. So this could include proposals such as those which we're exploring in the consultation: temporary opt-downs, pause mechanisms, all of those things that help lower earners and to save more. So we are, of course, running a specific session to discuss this in more detail, and would love to hear submissions, to receive submissions of research or work that people have done in this space on underpension groups. We're running that roundtable in March. Just finally, I will just quickly cover the timeline. This is very important, and we've been very highly sensitive to the timeline of our proposals, given that the current economic context, and also given the current cost of living crisis. So you can see this timeline. I'm not expecting you to read it all in detail. I'll pick out a few things. It's just really important to note that we're not calling for any material policy changes before 2024. We don't wish to see employer pension contributions, so worker pension contributions, increase before 2027. And employee pension contributions, we're looking at sort of 2031-ish. So it's a really specific point I just want to make here. We're proposing that employer contributions increase to 5% so that they match those of employees and achieve a 10% contribution overall by 2030. And then in the early 2030s, both should increase gradually just by a further 1% to reach that total of 12%. But we're looking at all of that calibration, like I say, in relation to all the other issues that I've raised. The timing of our report last year and also the timelines for this, for these proposals to be implemented have been discussed a lot already by PLSA membership, as you can imagine. We are trying to reflect the importance that we're placing on making progress on this issue, despite the really difficult context. So it's just a really important point that I wanted to raise right now. Other than that, I think I'll stop and come back to you, James, for any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alyshia. So 5 great steps there. And we put in the chat the big document report that sets these out, and which is a consultation to members, and we'll circulate that after the call, and ditto also with the retirement living standards section of our website that Simon was talking about. We'll send all that around, and it's in the chat. Quick question to you, Alyshia. What kind of traction and feedback are we getting from government, from the DWP, the Treasury, and so on these proposals?
Great question, James. So yes, there is quite a lot of consensus on some elements of the proposals, and many of these proposals are actually quite old, really. They're sort of iterations of old proposals, some of which don't necessarily sort of come from us. So there's quite a lot of consensus on the AE 2017 review, for example, those findings that I mentioned. There's pretty much unanimous consensus on those. Just a bit of news in case people are geeks like me. There was the 3rd stage of the Work and Pension Select Committee inquiry, was published last year also. I mentioned it already because they also talk about objectives, the importance of objectives. The government responded to it, I think it was yesterday. The days all merge into one. But the government response notes that it remains committed to that AE 2017 review change, and that needs to be implemented by the mid-2020s. Though a little bit disappointingly, there's still a lack of a clear timescale for that, and so we'll be continuing to call for it. But I mean, also the government noted progress that it's trying to make on the pensions gender gap, pension sharing on divorce, self-employed people, lower earners' views on changes to the lower earnings limit. All of these things are things that we have raised. So it illustrates that the government at least is listening, and listening to sort of the broad cries for some of these changes. There was, just to note though, the committee itself, in its sort of reaction to the government's response, noted some of the disappointments that we've had about increasing minimum contribution rates. So to give you an example, that is one area that we do think that we do need to continue to build consensus on. We've had lots of positive discussions with stakeholders within and without the traditional pensions industry actually on this issue, but and we do have a minister that's very interested, but there is still some work to do.
Okay, thanks, Alyshia, and good to know we're getting some positivity and listening coming back from the government. I'm going to go to Roy in a moment, but just before I do, I'm going to bring Simon in very quickly because we've got a couple of questions about that we want to clarify on one or two of the points he mentioned about retirement living standards. So Simon, just bringing those questions up. There's one from Ben Stafford and also Eve Keefe asking pretty much the same point. Let's see, Ben puts it, what would our figures, our projections look like if you take the tax-free lump sum out of the assumed pot? Because most savers do take the tax-free lump sum, as we know, and Eve makes the same point. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, I've not got those figures in front of me, but obviously, particularly for those the kind of lower ends of the standards, they'll be really heavily impacted by taking that out. So it would be worth looking at that to look at what's happening at the moment. But certainly the assumption is to try and maximising, obviously, income in retirement.
Thanks. And another quick one, Alistair Peck asks, is internet connectivity included in the basket of goods within the retirement living standards?
It is indeed, yeah. So that's why it's so important to keep the living standards refreshed, and we do that every year because we can, ensure that we keep abreast of technology and also people's expectations around technology as well. For the first time this year, we actually had a smart device entering into the minimum standard. So, the kind of little Amazon device you can get for £20 now, that is now seen as part of everyday living for everybody, really.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. And so let's bring Roy in from Jaguar Land Rover. Roy, I know you've been doing a lot of work getting people's contributions up. So a few questions about that to you, if I may. But maybe, Roy, you could just start by just telling us a little bit about the schemes you've got at Jaguar Land Rover and sort of paint that picture for us.
Yeah, absolutely, James. No problem. Like a lot of large employers, we do have a legacy DB scheme that we still run. That closed to new entrants back in 2010. So we still have about 8,000 active employees in that scheme. But since 2010, all our new starters have gone into our DC scheme, which is run by Scottish Widows. Yeah. And we operate contractual enrolment. So everybody goes in on the first day of the month following the start date with the company. So we operate that with Scottish Widows. So that's obviously our area of focus now, with about 23,000 employees in that scheme.
Yeah. So, I mean, this contributions, I mean, Alyshia was talking about, the policy ideas about getting contributions up, but you've been working on this in practice. So what are the contributions levels, and how have you gone about increasing them?
Yeah, absolutely. So our DC scheme, we have 3 tiers of contributions. The lower tier being 4% employee, 8% employer. Middle tier 5% employee, 9% employer, and then the upper tier 6% employee, 10% employer. Obviously, employees can pay more than 6% if they want to, but the maximum employer contribution is 10%. Okay. So what we did, we found we had a fairly even split between the lower and upper tiers, with a handful in the middle tier, and we realised sort of over the last sort of couple of years or so, obviously in light of the PLSA, so retirement living standards, that the 12% contribution basically wasn't enough. So we had a lot of discussions with the representative groups around the company, so the trade unions and others, about how we can actually look to improve that level of retirement savings. So we agreed that we would actually auto-escalate everybody who was in the lower tier, so the 4 and the 8, we would auto-escalate them to the middle tier, so the 5 and 9, and then all new starters, as they were contractually enrolled, would come in on the 5 and 9 tier as well. Now, at the time we were doing this, the cost of living crisis was probably just about starting to hit, so we were very mindful of that. So even though we were auto-escalating everybody, we did give everybody the option to go back down to the lower tier if they wanted to. So it wasn't like you are in the 5 and 9 and there's nothing you can do about it. There was that option. So we had to run a 3-month consultation. As part of that, we had some other changes on the go as well at the same time, but we wrapped them all up in one consultation. So after that 3 months, the auto-escalation went through in March last year, and pleasingly, we had a very, very low opt-out rate. We had about 9,500 people in the lower tier to start with, and at the end of the month window that we had to allow people to opt down, we only had about 50 people actually opt back down to the lower tier. So that was really, really pleasing. So we've now ended up in a position where we have a 50-50 split between the middle and the upper tier. So we were really pleased with that. We probably expected a higher opt-out rate than we actually got, but we were quite chuffed with that, to be honest. What we found over the last sort of year, well, nearly a year now, obviously as the cost of living crisis has got worse and worse, we have had a bit of a trickle of people going back down to that lower tier. We probably stand about 200 now, but still pretty low in the overall context of the scheme of 23,000 members. And we actually have more people who've actually gone from the middle tier to the upper tier than have gone down to the lower. Right. So it's been a really positive experience all round doing that auto-escalation. That's
great. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the opting up. So obviously that's quite a significant thing, actually, people doing that. Was fantastic to hear. So you do a lot of communicating with employees, Roy. I think you do. You've got contacts across the firm, you do road shows. Just talk us through what
Yep.
does that program look like, and what's most effective, do you find?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the past, we've probably done the more traditional kind of communications, newsletters, and e-communication. That probably wasn't quite cutting it. We felt obviously there were some employees who were highly engaged, others that weren't so. So what we did last year, we established what we call our pension contacts network. So we have probably about 30 employees dotted around all the various sites in the company who act as pension contacts. So people that any employee can go to get a little bit of guidance or help get pointed in the right direction. Obviously, they can't do advice, but they can give some guidance. And what we've been doing over the last 12 months is doing some training sessions with those contacts, pension contacts, and we're just about to roll out their names across the business in the newsletter that we're sending out next month. So then hopefully that will be the true test as to how effective this network has been, as hopefully people start to talk to them. And we're also in the process of over COVID, we had to do it virtually, but in March this year, Scottish Widows are coming out to do a roadshow around a number of our larger sites, and that will be a combination of presentations or just having a stand in a easily accessible area for people just to pop in and talk to representatives from Scottish Widows.
Brilliant. That's a great. That's fantastic about the contacts. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's been pretty positive. Like I said, the proof will be in the pudding once we roll out their names. I know the contacts are all a little bit nervous about that, but we've been doing quite a few training sessions with them to get them comfortable with what tools are out there for employees, what support Scottish Widows can provide.
And if we can help, Roy, maybe we want to come to one of our conferences or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah, we might start sending them along.
So, Roy, you're doing great stuff there. I mean, we've got a new pensions minister who Alyshia might tell us later. We're doing a bit of work with next week. But just imagine, Roy, for a moment, if you were the pensions minister, what would be your priority for improving the national pension system and tackling these problems Simon's been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, this is a personal opinion, not one of JLR, but I would certainly be looking to dramatically increase the minimum level of contributions payable for those being put into retirement savings. I'd also look to simplify it as well in terms of what definition of earnings we use, minimum age requirements, and so on. I'd certainly simplify that, but say dramatically increase the level of contributions from the employer.
Particularly the employer.
Particularly from the employer, yeah. I think they are way too low, and I'm quite pleased that JLR. I think we could do more, but we offer 10%, which isn't bad overall. Yeah,
and of course, part of our suite of proposals is getting employer contributions up to the same level as employer and employee contributions at the same level. Right, thanks so much. We'll bring you back in for a question or two. But actually, I'm just going to check if we've got any questions to you. I think we'll come back to you later because I want to bring in Simon again.
No problem,
James. Simon, you're just going to give us your assessment, I think, of if we were to make the sort of changes that Alyshia's been talking about and that Roy has been doing in practice, what difference would that make to the pensions landscape?
Thanks, James. Yeah, so dig down into the likely impact of the PLSA's proposals. We commissioned the PPI to model the retirement outcomes for different illustrative examples, mainly centered around the median earners, half median earners, and twice median earners, to try and get at the impact on different groups of savers. I should say that the next slides I'm going to show you are based on the modelling carried out prior to the announced change in the state pension and the new retirement living standards that we launched just a couple of weeks ago. So work is currently underway to revise these numbers in light of the changes to both of those, but for now we'll be using the original earlier modelling. Let's try and advance the next slide. There we go. So on this slide, you can see how the modelling was applied for each policy intervention for a median earner. As the light green bar on the left-hand side shows the pound amount for females, and the dark green bar is the amount for males. So you see we've mapped out the various interventions. So that's the current retirement outcome. So we've mapped out the various interventions applied in a cumulative way. So we start with lowering the age of the starting pension contributions to 18, then applying the removal of band earnings, then also raising the state pension to the minimum RLS. and then increasing contributions to 12%. And then finally, we've also added in a 4% voluntary contribution. So from this, you can see that the combined impact through to the 12% contribution takes a median male from a retirement income of around 15,300 to just over 19,000, which is a significant improvement in their living standard. So let's take a look at the analysis of these changes applied against the target replacement rates. So in this chart, you see, reading from top to bottom, we've set out the retirement income outcomes for a twice median earner, a median earner, and a half median earner, male and female. If we look at the bottom, first of all, the half median earners, both male and female, are both projected to exceed their pension commission replacement rate of 80% under the current system, as denoted by the purple shading. The cross-hatched shading shows that under our proposals to 12%, there is a risk of these groups becoming over-pensioned, as defined by the target replacement rate, if they remain lower earners throughout their lives. So it might be an example of where a mechanism to protect low earners from oversaving may be appropriate. However, for median earners, the orange shading shows that they are near to the pensions commission replacement rate but not expected to hit it. But under the policy proposals for 12% would turn to green, meaning that they would achieve their target replacement rate. If we have a look at the twice median earners, both males and females are red and currently not likely to hit their target. The proposals to 12% gets males to orange, so within proximity, but not females who remain in the red zone, and that's because of the difference in earnings across a lifetime. If we move up to 4% contributions, it gets males pretty much over the line to green and females not quite reaching it, but within proximity. If in my view, to make it more tangible and show the same cumulative policy measures to 12% against the retirement living standards, we can see substantial improvements in the pounds and pence retirement outcomes and living standards. So again, looking at our half median, median and twice median earners, working from the bottom to the top, we have half median earners gaining over 2,500 and moving to well over halfway between the minimum and the moderate. At the median, we'd seen an even larger increase, adding over 3,500 for females and 3,800 for males, leaving them just short of the moderate. And then finally, twice median earners are taken from around halfway between the minimum and the moderate to well over the moderate and enjoying many features of the comfortable lifestyle. If we also allowed for 4% voluntary contributions, that would obviously push median earners more to the right, so right up to the moderate standard for males and to around 20,000 for females. So that gives you a bit of an insight into the impact of the proposals, and that's the end of my slides for the session. So hopefully it's given you food for thought. I'd just like to remind you that we are in the process of updating these figures in light of the new retirement living standards, and the PPI are fantastically working away on that for us. And I'll hand back to you, James.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Simon. We made you work hard this morning, so thank you. Just got time for, I think, for a couple of questions before we wrap up. I think this might be one perhaps for Alyshia. So Ian McClellan is asking, if the state pension was increased up to the minimum retirement living standard level, would this offset the need to push on the minimum earnings, low earnings limit adjustments to auto-enrolment, because we're forcing low-paid people to make very small DC contributions? Alyshia, your comment on that?
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a really good question, and one that we're actually planning to look at over the course of this year, because it's something that concerns us a little bit, or concerns is a strong word, intrigues us a little bit, the sort of interaction between those on very low earnings, the removal of the lower earnings limit, any changes to the 10K trigger, and also interactions with the sort of state pension retirement replacement ratio equivalents. So maybe they achieve effectively a full replacement rate because they have the state pension that it or would be achieve a state pension that is higher than their current income, but also means tested benefits, because we know that interaction could, in its worst case, as you describe, requires people to make very small contributions throughout their working lives, and then actually disqualify them somehow in some future years for means tested benefits because they have too much saving. So I'm just going to refer, actually handily, I have an annex slide. You will receive all these slides, but I'm going to refer to an annex slide 4, I think it is, yes. So you can see I mentioned that I didn't go through all of the underpension groups, but I'm just going to refer to this slide quickly because you can see there's a sort of lower earners section in the middle there, third down in the box. And on the right-hand side, we talk about how we're going to do some research to better understand the needs, including intersectionality of these different groups. And as I've just described, we might look at reviewing opt-downs or other affordability protection mechanisms, but also looking specifically at that 10K trigger and the impact on future eligibility for state support. So it's a fantastic question. I don't have a sort of immediate off-the-shelf answer for you, I'm afraid, because and no, neither does anyone else as far as we're aware, and that's why we're going to do some additional research on it this year. So thank you, Ian, for the question. Great question.
And Alyshia, again, and this might be the last one, I think we've got a question from David Whittaker, and I'm not sure I totally follow this, and if we don't, David will get back to you and clarify and follow up. So David asks, is the PLSA also putting forward increasing the minimum contribution levels under the SEP 1, 2 or 3 alternative levels, which a lot of schemes certify against, and not just the absolute minimum levels?
This is a great question, and is a technical question on which we remain sort of open, I would say, David, I think would be the answer to that question. That notwithstanding that, we are talking in generality, we're talking about the absolute minimum levels, but the interaction between the alternative levels has come up in discussion while we were developing the proposals, and it is something that we'll continue to look at. So if you've got specific ideas on that, I'd be really interested to hear them, because if there are sort of refinements that we should be making, we're happy to make them. But yeah, at the moment, we are talking about the absolute minimum level, and that's what we've modelled.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alyshia. Well, the clock is has pretty much ticked round to closing time, so I think we'll draw the Q&A to a close. I'm just going to ask Roy to put his camera back on, just so I can thank all 3 of our brilliant speakers, Roy and Alyshia and Simon. Thank you all. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to Molly and Naomi, my colleagues who've been working away behind the scenes, making sure it all runs smoothly, sorting out the connectivity issues we had with Roy just before we went on air, and making sure the slides come up and down at the right time. So thanks a lot to Molly and Naomi. Thanks everyone who's dialed in. Great to see so many of you this morning. There were 1 or 2 questions we didn't quite get to, so we'll get back to you on those. We will circulate the slides and the recording and the links to the various documents we've mentioned. And I'm sure Alyshia would like me to say, do please have a look at the 5 steps to Better Pensions report, which is a consultation document, and let us have your views one way or another. There'll be a feedback form, of course, coming round after this, so please respond to that. Otherwise, thanks everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.